Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Birkbeck. My name is Brendan McGeever, and I'm a lecturer here at the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism, which is based at Birkbeck. And it really is a great pleasure of mine to welcome you this evening to this panel discussion around the theme Challenging Denial from Slavery to the Holocaust. Denial takes many forms. Laws prohibiting denial of Holocaust have been passed in various countries, but Holocaust denial itself is still very much with us, and its proponents are continuing to find new followers. And at the same time, denial contributes to the erasure of African enslavement in UK politics and wider culture. Today, Britain's role in slavery and its legacy is widely disregarded. And what a time, in fact, to be having this conversation. Like many of you, I awoke this morning to the news of the midterm elections in the United States. There's clearly a lot to distill from those results, and this is neither the time nor the place to do it. But one result did jump off the page. In the 3rd Congressional District of Illinois, a certain Arthur Jones ran for office on a platform of open Holocaust denial. Now, he lost the seat, but in doing so, he lost it by claiming 27% of the vote, a rather startling 56,500 votes in total, and in fact, they're still counting as we speak, I believe. And then, just last night on BBC Two Scotland, there was a programme about, or rather exploring, Scotland's role in transatlantic enslavement. The very first programme of its kind to be broadcast on national television in Scotland. Clearly, this is a conversation that has barely even begun. So I'm delighted then to welcome this evening and bring together this panel of 3 scholars, Dr. Keith Kahn-Harris, Dr. Caroline Bressay, and Professor Bruna Seu, who each in their very different ways are carrying out some of the most critical and cutting-edge work that can help us to not just understand denial, but also to challenge it. Now, each speaker is going to talk for approximately 10, 12, or at a push 13 minutes, and then afterwards we're going to have a conversation where we'll welcome contributions from the floor. So I'd like to now first introduce Dr. Keith Kahn-Harris, who is Senior Lecturer at Leo Baeck College and indeed Associate Lecturer here at Birkbeck. He's the author of Denial, The Unspeakable Truth, published just a few weeks ago by Notting Hill Editions. Keith is going to talk to us about denial and the Holocaust. So welcome, Keith.
And thanks to the Pears Institute for putting on what I hope will be a really interesting evening with a really interesting discussion. So I'm going to get the plug out of the way first. This is my book. I have 4 copies here. I suppose I should say that it is a book that draws on scholarship, but it is not an academic book. And it is an essay. It's a long essay. And what I try to do in that book is make some fairly sweeping, although hopefully not baseless, arguments about denial, about denialism, and what I go on to suggest is called post-denialism. And what I'm going to do here is set out that framework with the example that I'll be drawing most of, which is the Holocaust. Now, Bruna's going to talk about how denial is defined theoretically in a little more detail than I will. But I'd like to start just with Stanley Cohen's book called States of Denial, which is really the most theorized and account, or at least one of the very first theorized accounts of denial that we have. And he defines denial as a statement about the world or the self, which is neither literally true nor a lie, intended to deceive others, but allows for the strange possibility of simultaneously knowing and not knowing. The existence of what is denied must be somehow known, and statements expressing this denial must be somehow believed. Now, just that short quotation raises enormous amount of really what I think are very productive questions that I know that Bruno's going to be exploring in more detail, and that impinge on central questions of sociology, psychology, and psychoanalysis. But what I'm most interested in doing, and whilst my book is entitled Denial, that was really for marketing reason, because what I'm actually most interested in is a word that's a little uglier and a little less recognisable, and that is denialism. Now, denialism doesn't have the same intellectual pedigree, but it is quite widely used. And here's one definition of it by Mark and Chris Hufnagel, who are a couple of American doctors who run a blog that debunks what they call denialism. And they say denialism is the employment of rhetorical tactics to give the appearance of argument or legitimate debate, when in actuality there is none. These false arguments are used when one has few or no facts to support one's viewpoint against a scientific consensus or against overwhelming evidence to the contrary. They are effective in distracting from actual useful debate using emotionally appealing but ultimately empty and illogical assertions. Now, this is referring to things such as Holocaust denial, to climate change denial, to the anti-vaccine movement, to AIDS denialism, and various other forms of what I've sometimes called pseudo-scholarship. And I want to look here now at how the difference between denial and denialism plays out with regard to the Holocaust. So this is a book that I'm sure some of you may have read called Neighbours, which is about a Jewish community in Poland, in a place called Jedwabne, where the Polish residents of the village turned on their Jewish neighbours in what was a massacre. Now, the book occasioned tremendous debate within Poland about the complicity of Poles in the Holocaust. And it was very controversial, partly because there had been an enormous silence about these things. These things were known, but they were not talked about. And the debate, rather than the book, the debate about Jedwabne, or at least the length of time that it took, the decades it took for this book to be produced, tells us something about denial, that it is a kind of silence, but it's a pregnant silence. In contrast, denialism about the Holocaust is produced loudly, if you like, by institutions. This is the banner for the Institute for Historical Review, one of the earliest centres for what they call Holocaust revisionism, what I would call Holocaust denialism. And denialism is spread through publication, through talks, through institution building, through stuff. The aim is to build an edifice that looks like scholarship. The aim is to fill the world with something that is far from silent. So I'm just going to summarise the differences between denial and denialism here. Denial, as I said, creates silence or absence. Denialism creates noise and presence. Denial avoids the truth and is therefore vulnerable to it. Silence could always be punctured by something. Whereas denialism recreates truth or resists it, tries to build something different. Denial is produced individually. Now, I recognise that raised a lot of questions, but it's kind of individually, that can still be a mass of individual silence, but it may well be publicly enforced. There can be laws to prevent talking about certain things. Denialism is created institutionally and very publicly, and it may be publicly sanctioned, as in some countries Holocaust denial is prohibited by law. Denial's relationship to scholarship is one of deliberate ignorance, whereas denialism attempts to imitate or pastiche scholarship, to treat itself as the other side in a legitimate scholarly debate. And denial is opposed by people try to break denial by educating people, by by saying this is what happened, as in the book Neighbours. Whereas denialism is opposed by debunking, people like the Hufnagel brothers, people who go online to challenge denialist claims. Denialism, I don't have much time to talk about this, I'm afraid, but one of the things where you can spot denialism is that over the last few decades, it has developed its own techniques, ways in which it can fill that void, that can create that noise. And these things, for example, can be I'll just talk about one of them, obsession with detail. If you ever look at climate change denialists, they're obsessed with polar bear numbers in the Arctic. By focusing down on a micro question, you can therefore try and even the playing field. You can't dispute the general picture, but you can dispute polar bear numbers. Similarly, with Holocaust denial, there is a lot of David Irving made great play in his trial against Deborah Lipstadt, talked a lot about aerial photographs of chimneys at Auschwitz. Again, obsession with detail, a way of levelling the playing field. One of the problems, again, I don't have much time to talk about this, one of the things that recent work in neuroscience and psychology has showed is that denialism is extremely difficult to debunk, not because there is a problem with finding holes in the argument, because there are plenty of holes in the argument, but because denialists themselves and those who believe them may be very, very resistant to hearing alternative arguments. And so to some extent, a good denialist argument is any denialist argument. Something that fills the void, that creates noise and looks like scholarship is a good argument. And there are problems with this. So I'm not going to read this. This is from what's called, people have heard of the Lechter report. This was in the 1980s. An American gas chamber technician called Fred Lechter was commissioned to do a report on the gas chambers of the remains of the gas chambers at Auschwitz, and he concluded from that the gas chamber, that they were never used for killing humans, they were used for delousing. Now this is a little paragraph from that, and I have no way, absolutely no way of debunking that, because I don't know about fumigation techniques, I don't know anything about Zyklon B. So just by creating that, you create something powerful that is resistant to debunking. Now, why do we have denial and denialism? I suspect we're going to be talking about this later. What drives it? One thing that drives it is the emergence of uncomfortable facts. Imagine yourself working for the tobacco industry in 1964 in America when the Surgeon General's report came out. It would be very easy to see the writing on the wall, to see the end of something. Similarly, when Exxon had internal oil industry reports saying that global warming would almost certainly happen, then again, that creates a kind of crisis. Or The Origin of Species was not published in 2959, it was published in 1859. If you're a churchman then, these creates a sense of crisis, a sense of a fork in the road. And one way is to say if you're in the tobacco industry, we cannot sell this stuff anymore. But most people take another way, which we'll talk about. In this book by Bettina Stagneth, Eichmann Before Jerusalem, talks about how when Adolf Eichmann was in hiding, semi-hiding, in Argentina, he met with a group of neo-Nazis in a kind of discussion group. And the neo-Nazis there were desperate to be told that the Holocaust hadn't happened, which Eichmann didn't do. He told them that it did happen. There's a kind of desperation sometimes, but my principal point, and I may have to move on, finish on that, is that denial and denialism in particular arises when desires are rendered unspeakable, that you cannot speak of certain desires in the modern world. Take genocide. Genocide is, historically speaking, fairly common. Not only is it common, but there were times in history when you would celebrate wiping out a people. This is from, anyone know who this is from? This is from Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, where which was basically his own propaganda writing. And he's celebrating the fact that he has committed genocide throughout the book. These people laid to waste, this village was destroyed, and so on. This is inconceivable now, or at least became inconceivable in the process that we call the Enlightenment, with roots going back before. The problem is people still want to commit genocide, but they cannot speak of that desire. So instead of speaking that desire, they have to deny that denial exists. But I have some thoughts on slavery, but we can talk about those later. In my book, one of the things that I argue is that within denialist discourse, you can see an acknowledgement, an alternative to denial, poking through, if you like. You can see the desire. They come close to the point of consummation, and I'm using my words deliberately there, but they cannot quite reach it. So this is from a thread on a bulletin board for a committee for the open debate on the Holocaust. And this is from a denialist writing, someone who says that the Holocaust didn't happen. And says, why had the Nazis herded them to cattle cars and taken them to extermination camps to dispose once and for all of the Jewish problem? If Hitler had developed a final solution to the Jewish question, then there had to have been a Jewish problem. So you can see they get to the point almost of acknowledgement, but cannot quite reach it because that ultimate step is very difficult to take. Now, finally, one of the things I postulate in my book is that we're seeing the emergence of something called post-denialism. And you can encapsulate it in this tweet by Donald Trump. The concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. Now, of course, he's a climate change denialist. That has existed for a long time. But the argument he puts here isn't one that's made by mainstream climate change denialists. He just sort of essentially made it up. So it's denialism that starts to break down, that loses its scholarly trappings, and I would argue is getting closer and closer to the point where desire can be freely acknowledged. And we can see this within far-right circles recently about the Holocaust. This is from the Daily Stormer Style Guide. It's a far-right site and was leaked. The undoctrinated should not be able to tell if we're joking or not. They should be. I'm not going to read the rest. You can read it yourself. It's not very nice. But the point is that acknowledgement, the speaking of desire and denying it at the same time are wrapped up together. And I would argue that this is suggesting that the bounds of the unspeakable that gave rise to denialism in the first place are starting to break down. And how do we respond to that? What I suggest is that what this gives us is the possibilities of reckoning with previous hidden modern diversity. It's a very, very scary possibility to speak of people who actually want genocide, but perhaps we've been putting off this test for too long, because in modernity we've assumed that no one wants genocide, but some people do. There's a lot more to say, but we can talk about it later. Thank you.
Holocaust and slavery, and I'm specifically going to be talking about the enslavement of Africans and their exportation across the Atlantic, are two very different chapters of world history, occurring in different centuries, which took place in different places, with different institutional structures and with different effects. And I think there can be complex problems drawing those histories too close together, a risk of conflating two such different periods into a distorting comparative history, and an uncomfortable fight for recognition. What Michael Rothenberg discusses in his work on multidirectional memory as one of the most agonizing problems of contemporary multicultural societies. That is, how to think about the relationship between different social groups' histories of victimization, and how we might avoid a competition of victims between histories of slavery and the Holocaust. But despite the differences, and the concerns, and my own concern that I might not live up to Rothenberg's aspiration tonight. I think there are important themes of experience and research questions that link these histories and their interpretations by our contemporary society. Firstly, the levering of racial thinking to justify the institutionalisation of violence and how those ideas were maintained, their power, and why and how the majority of people accepted those ideas for so long. Why they were and perhaps remain so difficult to challenge, both by society at large and by those who were branded by them, be they with an iron on their skin or a star on their clothes. In both histories, there can be a tendency to blame the victims for the violence they faced. And in reply, historians of both subjects have the difficult task of animating silences in the archive to uncover how resistance was manifest and consider under which circumstances resistance could be deemed successful. These are dark histories where suicide and the killings of one's children might be considered a victory. With both historiographies, there is the need to break open the experiences of the victims, to think about how women, children and men experience these horrors differently, and in doing so, considering the importance of first-hand testimony by those who suffered is essential to both. But within these connecting themes, I think denial is produced around them in very different ways, in Britain at least, and I'm going to be focusing on Britain. In Britain, I don't think there is a denial around the slave trade as such. There might be arguments about the numbers, who were involved in the trade, the level of brutality, the structure of financial networks which produced and benefited from the trade. But there is not a denial that the slave trade took place. In part, this is because its existence is so clearly visible in the past and present of former British colonies in the Americas, but also because many white abolitionists are celebrated icons, and you can't celebrate an abolitionist without recognising that they abolished something. William Wilberforce was the most obvious example of this celebratory focus during the 1807-2007 bicentenary of the abolition of the British slave trade. And in many ways, the centenary and decades since reflect where denial around Britain and the slave trade exists. That is, I would argue, in the importance of slavery before and after abolition, the role of enslaved people in gaining their freedom, and the relationship of slavery to racial prejudice in Britain. So in the lead up to the bicentenary in 1807, a campaign was launched to erect a memorial to the enslaved who fought for abolition through uprisings, political campaigns, and everyday forms of resistance throughout its history. In 2005, a group, Memorial 2000, was formed to realise the idea of a permanent memorial to remember the enslaved and their descendants. They launched a competition for the design, and following a public consultation, the sculptor Les Johnson was announced as the winner. And this is an image of the maquette from the memorial's website. And I'm going to be focusing this evening on memorialisation, because I do think here there are some difficult relationships to be unpacked between the memorialisation of enslavement and the Holocaust. So when Memorial 2000 first looked for a site, they initially considered Victoria Tower Gardens because of its link to abolition. The 19th century Buxton Memorial to white abolitionists is cited there, and there is a plaque marking the 150th anniversary of the Anti-Slavery Society. It's also adjacent to Parliament, where the 1807 and later 1833 acts for the abolition of slavery were passed. But the royal parks rebuffed the group's approach, and they gave several reasons for this. Among them, that given the planned space required for the statue and the proposed plantings for a memorial garden around the statue, they did not feel there were any appropriate locations where such a memorial could be sited without undermining the community space, which contains part of the Jubilee Walkway and the Thames Garden on the Thames Path. Nor could they see a strong and demonstrable link between the subject and its proposed location as their guidelines required. But ultimately, the Royal Parks did not feel they could accommodate a further memorial in Victoria Tower Gardens. Now, some of you will know that this is the same place announced in October 2017 to be the site of the new Holocaust Memorial, which is being built at a cost of £50 million. There was clearly some room found. Many of you will also know that the proposal is not without its critics, including from within the Jewish community. And in response to those ongoing critiques, in October this year, a spokesman for the UK Holocaust Memorial Foundation, stated that no location in Britain is more suitable for memorial than Victoria Tower Gardens, alongside Parliament and amidst prominent memorials commemorating the struggle against slavery, inequality and injustice. That is a painfully ironic statement. The financial government support for this scheme also reflects a disparity in experience. While the Holocaust Memorial is being supported by the government in a myriad of ways, Memorial 2000 have not been offered any financial support. But that disparity is not just with the Holocaust Memorial. Other government memorials, supported memorials, include one to the women who served during World War II on the Mall, which was opened by the Queen several years ago. And this is not to say that there is not a good reason for state support for these, nor am I arguing that there is not a good reason to build a memorial and learning centre for the Holocaust, nor that such a space should not be supported by the government. But this commitment to one rather than another horror begs the question as to why a memorial for the enslavement, murder and institutionalised killing of millions of people within the British Empire is not able to call upon similar government support. And one answer, I think, is denial. A denial that slavery and the fight for its abolition was a long and significant part of the British economic, political and cultural social life, that though the slave trade was abolished in 1807, slavery was not, a denial that British colonies in the Americas established and maintained places that oversaw some of the most degrading treatment of human beings in recorded history, a denial that the people who oversaw the management of these spaces were British and that Britain benefited from their work, a denial that the British government sided with the slave owners at the moment of abolition, that rather than acknowledging the enslaved to be people and granting them freedom and compensation as men, women and children, as abolitionists such as John Ritchie, a Scottish theologian not so often heard of or celebrated, demanded. They were legally defined as private property, and on the moment of slavery's abolition in some British colonies in 1838, it was the slave owners who were awarded compensation at a cost of £20 million, the equivalent of 40% of the government's budget that year. There is the denial that half of this money was paid to slave owners in Britain, and the denial that that infusion of this blood money permeated all forms of British life. As more research utilising the legacies of British slave ownership database is undertaken, it will perhaps make these positions harder to maintain, but it's interesting to think about Keith's point about whether that actually matters. To what extent can you puncture these things? But for now, there is still a disavowal that some of our most celebrated icons received or directly benefited from compensation money, a denial that slave compensation money that created and maintained political elites in the 19th century can be traced to MPs who sat in the House of Commons in the 21st, a denial that deep structural inequalities in contemporary life can be mapped upon the geographies of slavery, a denial that the scandalous and unjust treatment of the Windrush generation throughout their lives, not just during the most inhumane denial of their citizenship, has its legacies in the histories of slavery and the refusal to acknowledge the institutionalised racism that these histories established. A denial that the legacies of slavery are ingrained into the treatment of many black communities today, from their overrepresentation in prisons and mental health care to their underrepresentation in the institutions where power and change are enacted in Britain. But though these points of denial are very different to those associated with the Holocaust, they are two sides of the same commemorative coin. For the British, acknowledging the enslaved in 2007 was difficult, for to do so inevitably highlights its deep relationship with the slave trade and slavery itself. The Holocaust is easier for the British to the Holocaust is easier for the British to commemorate because Britain's role fighting against it, as it is usually and uncomplicatedly portrayed, is relatively easy to celebrate. The proposal for the new Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre is to feature, to quote one report, a series of 23 imposing bronze-fin structures with the spaces between each symbolising the 22 countries where Jewish communities were destroyed during the Holocaust. As the Channel Islands are not technically a country, I'm guessing there's no space representing Jersey or Guernsey. The Telegraph reported that this would be the first UK's Holocaust memorial, and that's clearly incorrect. There is an, albeit rather small, memorial in Hyde Park and another at Liverpool Street. This statue commemorates the Kinder transport and represents a particular moment, depicting 5 young children arriving to safety in Britain. Erecting in 2003, the Arrival, as it's called, is part of a series of 4 sculptures which have been erected along the Kindertransport's route. The others by the same sculpture are Kindertransport, The Departure in Danzig, Trains to Life, Trains to Death at Berlin, and Channel of Life in Rotterdam. The plaque on the statue at Liverpool Street records to quote, the gratitude of the people of to the people of Britain for saving the lives of 10,000 unaccompanied, mainly Jewish children who fled from Nazi persecution in 1938 and 39. But there is little space here for reflection on those relatively low numbers, why they came alone, nor what happened to them once they arrived. And my suspicion is that had Memorial 2000's proposal incorporated a representation of the white British men and women who had campaigned for abolition, it likely would have found more favour and financial support, and that is, of course, the point. We are still at the stage where questioning the celebration of a man who declared himself to, quote, prefer land to niggers is framed not as a legitimate form of debate about British urban landscapes or the preservation of a statue of Cecil Rhodes at an Oxford college, but as a failure to face up to historical facts and to abide by the values of a liberal open society that, quote, tolerates freedom of speech across the board. A discussion about how to overcome the politics of competition in historiography and heritage spaces means we find ourselves back, unsurprisingly, in far broader arguments of identity, power, belonging, and the politics of place, about the researching of history, how it is funded and who does it, how we find space to speak to and about our difficult histories, how we find the common threads between our experiences and understand the differences. Some countries in the Americas and Europe have found ways to integrate difficult histories into their memorial landscapes. Britain is not yet one of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the Pears Institute for inviting me to this very interesting event. And also many thanks to you for coming to the event and wanting to hear about this. So I was asked to answer 3 questions. How has denial been theorized? How does it work? And how can we combat that? All in 10 minutes. So clearly, I cannot do justice to all 3 questions. So what I'm going to do is focus mainly on the first 2, hoping also to touch on the last one, which is how do we combat denial. But also, I'm sure it will come up through questions and comments in the discussion. I want to start from what I've sort of concluded, which seems very basic, but I think is really important. And that is that when thinking about denial, it's important to differentiate between 2 very different positions. They at times overlap, but I think they're quite different and important to look at both of them. One is, of course, I would act, respond, engage, but I can't. And that is quite different from saying, I could act, respond, engage, but I won't. So the first speaks of a willingness to respond and engage with painful or difficult issues, but encountering difficulties or obstacles. While the second refers to a pre-arrived decision or position that cannot be openly acknowledged and thus has to be cloaked in justifications and rationalizations. And I think this is really what Keith was referring to in terms of denialists. I believe we need to understand and attend to both because very different actions are required. And very often the 2 overlap and one feeds off the other. So, in terms of theorization of denial, current theorizations and investigations are primarily concerned with what happens in the gap between knowledge and action. But if we look at Freud, where he all starts, he actually wasn't primarily concerned with how denial informs action or inaction, but rather on the traumatic knowledge and the affects triggered by that knowledge. So in his first formulation of denial, Freud referred to denial as a mode of defense, so one of the defense mechanisms that we all use to some extent, which consists in the subject refusing to recognize the reality of a traumatic perception. Later, in describing the paradox of knowing and not knowing, it distinguished between the disavowal of the idea of something unacceptable to the mind and the repression of the related affect. Knowledge of traumatic events or disturbing knowledge is too threatening to confront, but impossible to ignore. So, Freud theorized, we resort to a compromise solution, which is to deny and acknowledge them at the same time. Many years later, in his book Psychic Retreats, John Steiner referred to the subject's use of perverse arguments to misinterpret the facts, a way of dealing with reality which, in Freud's words, almost deserves to be described as artful. More recently, this idea has been revisited from a psychosocial perspective by Paul Hoggett, who also theorizes the way in which denial operates in the developed world as perverse thinking. Perverse thinking involves three stances: skepticism, turning a blind eye, and internal propaganda. Skepticism is based on doubt, which is a complex and slippery entity, actually. The capacity for doubt has been seen as one of the most important virtues of contemporary society. But for example, many climate change skeptics use the Enlightenment version of doubt as their defense. Skeptics argue that the scientific predictions are estimates, not proof. And in the absence of truth, the value of accumulated evidence and theory is annihilated. Hoggett argues that this is a perverse misrepresentation of the process of science, and furthermore, this enables the denialists, and this is important, to position themselves as being outside the consensus and the real bearers of truth, while consensus is construed as a conspiracy against free thinkers and liberal values. Does it ring any bells? Turning a blind eye refers to the human desire not to know. Primo Levi, commenting on Holocaust deniers who lived in Germany and German-occupied territories at the time of the transportation to the concentration camps, observes that, and I quote, "the common technique was to try to know as little as possible, and therefore not to ask questions." End of quote. In Vellacott's reinterpretation of the Oedipal myth, turning a blind eye is a method whereby a truthful experience is drained of its emotional significance, and again, this is very important, leaving it simply as a useless fact. In this way, we know, but what we know no longer disturbs us because the meaningfulness of the thought has been drained away. The third stance, internal propaganda, refers to an artful engagement with the truth, which is essential to perverse thinking and denial. It refers to the rationalizations and little half-truth that we tell ourselves. For example, escaping guilt about climate change by shifting blame, and Keith gave an example of this. It is the fault of the Chinese or the Indians who are polluting the world, or through emotional numbing. Despite differences between these theorizations, all these share two key components. First, they share an interest in the relationship between cognition and affect, thus suggesting that in order to understand and combat denial, we need to engage with truth, but also with how what we know affects us emotionally. Second, the disconnect between knowledge, affect, and action involved in most forms of denials requires, as Freud put it, energetic action and agency. That is, in order to challenge denial, we need to understand what we do with or to the knowledge in order to interfere in the knowledge-affect dynamic. So how to change the emotions or get rid of the emotions. These two factors immediately destabilize the modernist and simplistic belief that if only people knew, they would act. Clearly, this is not the case, and indeed, each of the components in the knowledge-affect-action continuum need careful examination. To begin with, knowing is far from unproblematic. We live in a highly mediated world, and the sheer volume of information, the speed at which we get to know about things, their soundbite modality, and crucially, the environment of fake news makes it very difficult to ascertain exactly what we know, why we know it, and why are we getting to know about something at this particular moment. Truth seems to be fluid and up for grabs, and experts are no longer the authoritative holders of truth or irrefutable facts. Instead, in the political arena, we witness daily battles of words. Stan Cohen's theorization of denial grapples precisely with the cultural, political, and psychological factors involved in denial. Cohen claims that differently from not knowing, simply lying or deliberately choosing not to know, we're sometimes not entirely aware of switching off or blocking out that information. Denial, therefore, is neither a matter of telling the truth, not intentionally lying. There seem to be states of mind, or even whole cultures, in which we know and don't know at the same time. He proposed a typology of denial as three distinct, although at times overlapping modalities of denial: literal, interpretive, and implicatory denial. In the first, literal denial, the fact or knowledge of the fact is denial. There was no Holocaust. Or, as Trump said on his presidential campaign, there is no global warming or climate change. In interpretive denial, the raw facts are not denied, but given a different meaning to that which seems apparent to others. So, for example, I am a social drinker, not an alcoholic. This was not torture, but robust and legitimate interrogation. Or, in a more recent statement from Trump, okay, there is global warming, but it's not man-made. The observer disputes the cognitive meaning given to an event and reallocates it to another class of events by changing words, using euphemism, or adopting technical jargon. Finally, implicatory denial, which in a way is the one that interests me the most, refers to those explanations that do not deny the reality of the event or their conventional interpretation, but deny the psychological, political, or moral implications that conventionally follow. Cohen's main interest, indeed, was the multitude and convoluted vocabularies of denial, justifications, rationalizations, evasions, which are used to attempt to bridge the moral and psychic gap between what you know and what you do. Cohen, therefore, claimed that denial operations are not mysterious internal states, but typical vocabularies with clear functions. They provide good stories, that is, believable stories, like this is what I do, but also provide moral accountability for the speaker. This is why what I do is right. These formulations clearly suggest that referring to denial as a passive state of being in denial is an insufficient conceptualization of denial. Instead, we should be looking psychosocially at the artful ways of doing denial. So going back to the two stances offered at the beginning of this talk, it's not sufficient to just look at people who would otherwise act, but they can't, but also at operations of denial that support those who could, but won't act. In my work on audience responses to knowledge of human rights violations, I identified three modalities of doing denial. In particular, the second, shoot the messenger, is very visible in the news. And Keith has mentioned some of these operations. Its function is to undermine the claims of experts by questioning their credibility, authority, and motivation. The third, babies and bathwater, captures what Hoggett calls skepticism of the perverse thinking. Its function is to strategically find faults in particular kind of knowledge. For example, the scientific prediction of climate change scientists. When these operations of denial are institutionalized, we have denialism. In his last work, Cohen argues that denialism is expressed in a learned, shared public language. It's the activities of policymakers and moral entrepreneurs which are organized, planned, intentional, and sometimes less obviously ideological. This formulation echoes that of Orestes and Conway's, who conceptualized denialism as an industry, with doubt being its main product. On similar lines, and in relation to climate change, Hamilton argues that denialists have at their disposal the instruments of democratic practice to erode the authority of professional expertise. And this is where it gets tricky. And Nelken urges us to be cautious and mindful of the fine line that exists between denial and the unpredictable and varied expression of free speech. Indeed, and inevitably, the democratic right to freedom of expression leaves us in a bewildering supermarket of discourses. It might be helpful to remember then that the key The key to the rhetorical work that accompanies operation of denial is that denial is not only aimed to make truth claims, but also to secure a moral position for the speaker. For example, only last week in a radio interview on what stance the UK should take in relation to selling to Saudi Arabia the weapons used to oppress Yemen, thus violating international human rights law, both Michael Heseltine and Philip Sands took ostensibly moral positions. Heseltine drew on a strategic discourse and claimed that it was important for the UK not to stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, to be able to, as he put it, influence from inside Saudi's operations. This is an excellent example of interpretive denial. Yes, we continue to sell arms to human rights violators, but we're not collaborators and aiding human rights violations. We're changing things from the inside. Philip Sands, on the other hand, framed the dilemma as a matter of principle. We can either be accomplices in the atrocities or refuse to collaborate. Ostensibly, however, both are morally based arguments, see? As both speakers claim the position of wanting to protect the Yemen population. This is partly what makes denial operations so difficult to identify and combat. So moving on to the third question of what can be done to combat denial, very shortly, briefly, it seems that the first and inevitable step whenever wanting to combat denial is to enter the rhetorical field by identifying narratives of denial and their function and countering them with counter-narratives. This, I'm afraid, is a Sisyphean battle that cannot be fought once and for all, but needs to adapt as operations and vocabularies of denial multiply and become increasingly sophisticated. Importantly, the battle involves difficult strategic decisions. For example, the Han warns about the dangers of using denial and denialism to refer to both Holocaust denialism and climate change denialism. He argues that in the case of climate change, there is and ought to be room for scientific skepticism, whereas with regards to the Holocaust, there ought not to be room for reasonable doubt. Legally, as Keith pointed out, this difference matters enormously. In some jurisdictions, Holocaust denial is a criminal offense, whereas denial of climate change is legitimate under the principle of freedom of expression. He concludes that we need to avoid speaking about denialism, above all in relation to matters such as Holocaust denial. And he says, in relation to gross human rights violations, we should have serious doubts about the analytic usefulness and political implication of denialism as a concept, because by applying denialism the way currently used, we run the risk that gross human rights violations, a crime against humanities, become an object of pseudoscientific debate about facts and their interpretation, while, if only as an intended consequence, the moral dimension of denial are overlooked, i.e. the moral responsibility of acknowledging the fact and the moral obligation to intervene in order to protect. But there is a complete different argument. So what I'm saying is difficult. It's really difficult. In other words, for the hand, by talking about extreme human rights violation in terms of denials, we implicitly somehow concede that there is something to debate. So it's a double bind, really. So I don't have time to talk about the role of conflict and ambivalence, a bit of cliffhanger here, everyday denial and clashes of morality, nor about relationship between disavowal, increased anxiety and despair. But I want to conclude with Stan Cohen's words on climate change denial, when he reviewed the inadequacy of formulating denials in terms of a gap between knowledge and action. In order to understand how denial works and to combat it, we need, and I quote, a flowing, fluid narrative rather than the static images of gaps to study both the internal discourse and how or whether this reaches the everyday concerns of ordinary people. Thank you.